Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It is 11 a.m. Pacific time on a Saturday. I am in full beat for all of you guys. So thank you for your time. My name is Luisa Martinez. I'm co-chair of Portland DSA on DSA's International Committee and one of the editors of Partisan magazine. So thanks so much for joining us. We've titled the event Anti-Racist Unionism, Ben Fletcher and the IWW, featuring local activists from Portland's childcare industry. So just as a reminder, the event is hosted by Portland DSA's Red Caucus and Libertarian Socialist Caucus, and we've also been endorsed by Portland Jobs with Justice. So I am, for one, excited to hear from our speakers. We'll be hearing from historian and author Peter Cole and Portland childcare worker / labor organizers Olivia and Opal Brockschmidt. So the presentation the format will be, we'll hear a presentation from Peter, followed by a presentation from Olivia and Opal, followed by questions, some of which will come from me, the facilitator, and then some from the audience. For those of you in need of ASL, simply look for ASL as far as the participants. And so we have two wonderful people joining us today to fill that role, one of which is Andrew and the other is Angela. And so all you have to do is type in the chat ASL interpreter and then look to the top 3 dots and hit pin. And so then you'll be able to access that. We are limiting the use of chat to ensure that people can follow what speakers are saying, but we absolutely want audience participation and audience questions. We specifically chose the meeting format over the webinar format. And so, we want this to be a discussion. We're socialists after all. So if you have questions that you'd like speakers to consider, please send a private message to Keith, host / Keith Guthrie. Just go ahead and send that along. We have door prizes. So we'll be giving away 5 copies of Peter's book, Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. And then what we're gonna do is randomly select 5 names from the list of meeting participants and then announce them near the end of the meeting. So please let us know if the name you're using right now is not the name that you registered with, so we can make sure that we can get your mailing address. So I am going to go ahead now and introduce Peter Cole. So he is a professor of history at Western Illinois University in Macomb and a research associate in the Society Work and Development Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Cole is the author of the award-winning Dockworker Power, Race and Activism in Durban in the San Francisco Bay Area and Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Era Philadelphia. He co-edited Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW, and is the founder and co-director of the Chicago Race Riots of 2019 Commemoration Project. So Peter, if you want to get started. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks, Lisa, for that introduction and for allowing me to speak literally. And thanks to everyone for being here this morning. It is afternoon where I live, and so I'm a little confused, but I should survive. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled to sort of be speaking to people and to be joined with some labor organizers, Opal and Olivia. Thank you so much for joining, right? And so I'm going to share my screen. You all have to stare at me. You can stare at some hopefully cool pictures, right, while I present on this subject. All right. So racial capitalism is alive and well in 2021. But there was even more extreme racism, xenophobia, and inequality in the 19 teens. Ben Fletcher was the most important leader of the IWW's most effective interracial union, which controlled the Philadelphia waterfront for a decade through its militancy and direct action tactics. Fletcher is one of the most important Black labor figures in US history, yet few people, even on the left, know his name. But he couldn't be more relevant to the political projects of the present. I hope you'll agree after listening to me tell you a bit more about him. So Ben Fletcher was born African-American man in Philadelphia. His parents had moved to Philadelphia in the 1880s from the state of Virginia. It is quite possible that his parents were born enslaved, although we're not sure about that. Although it seems pretty clear that his parents fled the Jim Crow South for what they hoped would be better life in the North, in Philadelphia. However, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in his very first book called The Philadelphia Negro, racism defined the Black experience in Philadelphia, especially in terms of the opportunities for jobs that Black men and Black women were able to find. Philadelphia, which was the third biggest city in the country at that time, was a mighty industrial city, and also had the largest Black population outside of the South at that time, was very conservative, and really was very hostile to unionism, nicknamed by one labor organizer a scab town, nicknamed by another organizer the graveyard of unionism. I could also go on and just point out that in more recent times, that Philadelphia's history of racism is well known, well established, but I just sort of could name the person Mumia Abu Jamal, right? Or I could name the fact that the city of Philadelphia bombed Black nationalist move housing in West Philadelphia in the 1980s as two examples. So Ben Fletcher, like I said, born in 1890, around the age of 20, he joined the Industrial Workers of the World, as well as the Socialist Party. At that time, it was actually quite common for people to be both Wobblies and Socialists, as in terms of the Socialist Party, although he would later split with the Socialist Party, as did most Wobblies, and vice versa. Fletcher was, well, he didn't graduate high school. We don't know how much formal education he finished, probably some high school, but he was already working in his mid-teens, what then was called a day laborer or a casual laborer. And so he would have basically worked various different manual labor occupations, including finding work on the waterfront, which was just a short walk from where he grew up in South Philadelphia. We know that he joined the IWW no later than 1911. And we know that very quickly he became known prominently locally as a very good speaker, and that he was speaking in Philadelphia, but also throughout the area, the region. And it's also worth noting that, you know, although Philadelphia's Black population was significant, it was overwhelmingly full of native-born whites and European immigrants. And so he was regularly speaking to and organizing among what probably was predominantly European immigrant and European American working class people, as well as, but not only African Americans. Why he joined the IWW? Well, you know, 1905, when the IWW was founded, is a fascinating time to sort of think about. Yeah, in 1905, several hundred radicals, revolutionaries met in the city of Chicago in order to form a new labor federation. They did so because at that time, the United States was dominated by corporations. There was literally no governmental regulations whatsoever. This is before government regulated anything. There was a tiny capitalist class that basically had the government do its bidding, including using army and police to sort of beat up union drives, kill strikers and whatnot. The working class was incredibly weak. Very few Americans were in unions. Most of those who belonged to unions belonged to the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And at that time, the AFL chose to not organize most women, not organize most African Americans, not organize most immigrants, not organize most so-called unskilled workers, and was only interested in essentially the small group of predominantly native-born white male skilled workers in order to help them make a bit more money and work fewer hours. So in other words, the mainstream labor movement chose to not organize most working class people in America. It also was nationalistic, hence the name American Federation of Labor. By contrast, the IWW very intentionally rejected nationalism, including in its name, the industrial workers of the world. They understood that capitalism was global, so the solution to capitalism also must be global. They immediately chose to organize all workers regardless of their ethnic, racial, sex, national identities, right? So very clearly organized in ways entirely oppositional to the existing labor movement. I also do want to point out, for those who sometimes compress history, this is just 9 years after, for instance, the US Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson. Right? And so racism is rampant. Immigration is actually, in terms of numbers of immigrants, is at an all-time high in US history up to that point. And xenophobia is growing, right? And so what we've got is this intense society, right? Where hundreds of radicals, including Eugene Debs, including Mother Jones, including Lucy Parsons, including Bill Haywood, form the IWW, whose motto famously is an injury to one is an injury to all, as a challenge to the existing labor movement, but also as a challenge to basically the existing economic system as we know it. I'm going to focus really a lot on the city of Philadelphia and on the waterfront of Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the third biggest city again, and one of the biggest ports in the country. Thousands and thousands of men every day looked to get hired to work loading and unloading ships on the waterfront. Let me just make clear, and then we can sort of put it aside for now. This was an all-male workplace in an all-male industry, right? And so we say longshoremen because there were no longshore women at that time, right? All the men who showed up to try to get jobs, including Ben Fletcher, including African Americans, including European immigrants, including native-born white men, would have had to get hired in this process known as the shape-up. Basically, hundreds of people might show up at a pier in order to get dozens of jobs, and then the hiring boss would pick and choose who they wished, right? This system was hated by workers, kept workers weak and divided, and kept wages very low. When workers were able to get work, which was fewer days than they might want, the work itself was very heavy, very dangerous. Manual labor in day and night, in good weather and bad, for 12 hours, 24 hours, 36-hour shifts sometimes happened, right? When I say about heavy labor, I'm talking about the fact that it was common for men to have to carry 200-300 pounds on their backs up and down the holds of ship for 10 or 12 hours. Incredibly dangerous work, right? Literally, you could die on the job every single day that you went to work, right? Now, although the hiring process weakened workers, the actual labor process arguably helped workers because workers could not load and unload ships by themselves. They quickly were sort of paired into gangs. You often had a partner, but then you often worked in a gang of, say, 15 or 20 men. There might be 5 or 6 gangs on a ship. And so there was very much a collective identity among those who worked on the waterfront, including the fact that the only ones who might help you if you got hurt or to help prevent you from getting hurt were your fellow workers. Also, the gap between the bosses and the workers was very high. No one sort of misunderstood which side you were on, right? You're either us or them. There is no we're together on this. There's no associates on the waterfront, right? They are workers and bosses, right? And so those, in other words, inculcate identities that are meaningful and valuable for us to appreciate. I do want to give a sort of a quick shout out maybe to the fact that this industry, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, but I appreciate the city of Portland as a port, even if not a mighty port, right? But that the shipping industry is really the first industry of the world. It is trade, right? It predated capitalism, but literally capitalism as a system and imperialism, which really sort of in a European project, co-rise together on the ship. Without the modern ship, you do not have European empire, nor do you have capitalism, I would suggest. But also, we see this in the very origins of the term strike. So some of you may not be aware that the word strike is maritime in origins. In London, England, then in the 1700s, 1760s, the greatest port city in the world at that time, dock workers basically and sailors take down the sails of the ship in order to stop work to press their bosses for a raise. The nautical term for taking down the sails of a ship is called to strike the sail. And that becomes the de facto term we use to this day around the world in English to describe work stoppages, right? And so in other words, the origins of the word strike is nautical. And that also tells us something about the centrality of this industry. So with that as sort of a heavy background, let me talk a little more quickly about Philadelphia. The Philadelphia waterfront was diverse, maybe 1/3 African-American, 1/3 Irish and Irish-American, 1/3 European immigrants. The bosses regularly hired exclusive gangs, meaning all Polish, all Italian, all Black, in order to further divide and weaken workers and increase productivity. However, in the spring of 1913, thousands of dock workers shut down the Port of Philadelphia for several weeks. And in the midst of this strike, received a charter from the IWW called Local 8, right? And this is the birth of this union and the emergence of the Ben Fletcher as a leader. This union immediately integrated the waterfront. And so where I say employers created segregation, in other words, it was the bosses who divided workers based on race, sex, etc. The union was the one who integrated their gangs. So as they abolished the shape-up, instead employers would have to call up the union and get workers. And then when the union dispatched men to the job, they would dispatch multi-ethnic, multiracial gangs, right? They also integrated their union from its birth. This is 51 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It finally ended legal segregation. And of course, it was years after that many institutions still grapple with that. Local 8, as I already mentioned, abolished the shape-up. How do you know who's in the union and who's not? The union, if you paid your monthly dues, very small, would get a new button. And then once you had sort of proven your sort of literally paid your dues, you would then be dispatched to jobs. And if employers tried to hire non-union members, you could see who else was wearing their current button. And workers would constantly go on strike or threaten to strike in order to ensure that employers would only hire Wobblies. The Wobblies never signed contracts, and so they only enforced this through workplace activism, right? The Wobblies also instituted a number of holidays, most importantly their birthday. They would go on strike, which is to say they would celebrate by not working their sort of union. I've already been highlighting this point in the last few slides, but really the IWW is all about direct action on the job, and that if you sign a contract, well, most labor contracts, including mine with the American Federation of Teachers, include no strike clauses. So if you sign a contract, you've given up your most important power, which is to stop work, right, or to threaten to stop work. And so the IWW very much embraced this sort of actions of rank and file members on the job. Local 8 controlled the waterfront for really almost a decade. And Fletcher increasingly became well-known nationwide in the union and was dispatched regularly to other ports in order to organize. It was in one such case in the spring of 1917 when Ben Fletcher is in Norfolk, Virginia, whose dock workers are predominantly African-American, where while organizing in the port of Norfolk, a place he had been before, that he is threatened with a lynching by a white mob and escapes a possible lynching at that moment. He knew, as a Black organizer in an interracial anti-capitalist movement, that he was very much susceptible to sort of the risk of lethal violence, right? And remember, in this era, dozens and dozens of Black men and the occasional Black woman were lynched every year in the United States of America. And so he fled, actually was smuggled out on a ship that ended up in Boston in the spring of 1917. It was while he was in Boston that the federal government started spying upon him shortly after the United States declares war. The United States declared war in the spring of 17. It immediately targeted the IWW as the first threat and biggest threat to the United States of America, even though you could debate that. And as a result, hundreds of Wobblies were spied on, arrested, and Fletcher and about 100 other Wobblies were part of a mass trial in the city of Chicago for the middle of 1918, put on charges of espionage and sedition. It was during this time that Fletcher became known as a really humorous man. A lot of his humor turned on the absurdity of racism, which he appreciated made him vulnerable to violence, but also rendered him somewhat invisible. So during the trial, he turned to his fellow worker and friend, Big Bill Haywood, said, you know, if it wasn't for me, there'd be no color at all in this trial. And then once the sentences were being read out in the fall of 1918, all guilty on all counts, Fletcher turned again to Haywood and said, the judge isn't using proper grammar today. And Haywood said, how's that, Ben? And Fletcher said, it's because his sentences are much, much too long. In fact, Ben Fletcher was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the crime of being a radical, as well as a $30,000 fine. Fletcher and everyone else in trial was found guilty in that trial. I also like to point out that Ben Fletcher, as a political prisoner, would have been the second most important Black political prisoner in the early 20th century. It is a few years afterwards. Marcus Garvey will later be sentenced to prison too by the federal government. When Fletcher gets to federal prison along with 100 other Wobblies, he's in Leavenworth in eastern Kansas, the most well-known and first and largest federal prison. Fletcher doesn't talk much about his time in prison, but another famous radical who's in Leavenworth with him, and his Ricardo Flores Magón, a sort of a Mexican anarchist and revolutionary who was also good friends with many Wobblies. Magón wrote about living in Leavenworth, caught by the formidable mechanism of a monstrous machine, my flesh getting ripped open, my bones crushed, my moans fill the space and make the very infinite shudder, but the machine will not stop grinding and grinding and grinding. Nevertheless, my friend Christina Hetherington has written about Leavenworth as being the University of Radicalism, because Fletcher is with hundreds of other Wobblies, communists, anarchists, religious objectors, Black army soldiers who have been found guilty of treason, and others who are all thrown together in this sort of somewhat exciting place in a way. Fletcher's mail, like every other political prisoner in Leavenworth's mail, was sort of opened and transcribed and read. Ironically, that's how I, as a historian, am able to sort of know much about his time in Leavenworth, is through these federal records, right? In one letter that he wrote on New Year's Eve, 1919, just before 1920, he wrote to a socialist friend in Milwaukee, "We are living in momentous times. None of us are gifted with the power of clairvoyancy as to be able to foretell the day or the hour. Therefore, the first and most important duty is for all of us to prepare ourselves for the final chapter in the life of capitalism." So Fletcher said after spending a year in Leavenworth. He got out of prison not that well, several years after that. Local 8 had managed to survive, but was weakened very much by the employer and government repression. In late 1922, members of the IWW Local 8 are locked out by employers, receive massive help from the federal government, but also from a rival union. There's other issues in play too, the rise of the Soviet Union, the emergence of the rivals Communist Party. Nevertheless, for all these reasons and more, the union is split, right? And the IWW loses power on the waterfront in late 1922. Nevertheless, the following year, the Messenger, a newspaper, a monthly written by A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen out of Harlem, dubbed Fletcher still the most prominent Negro labor leader in America. A few years later, the ILA, the AFL-L's union, is able to reorganize the Philadelphia waterfront, who are able to get an 8-hour day finally, but the union that they have is very, very undemocratic, very corrupt. That union also allows the shape up to return and segregated gangs to return. It won't be until the 1970s that those two forces are rid of again, and the neighborhoods around the waterfront become more hostile to Black residents, allegedly. Racism in Philadelphia, in other words, continue, even though the IWW is very fiercely anti-racist throughout this time, as well as anti-xenophobic, as this amazing poster from the early 1920s reveals. Around 1930-31, Ben Fletcher moves to New York City. Why, actually, I'm not sure, but he spends maybe the last 18 years of his life in New York City, living mostly in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood now known as being a sort of a very Black neighborhood, Bedford-Stuyvesant, although in the 30s, Bed-Stuy was not, in fact, a predominantly Black neighborhood. He never really recovered physically from his working class life in maybe his prison time. He has a major stroke in his 40s in the mid-1930s. And although he remains very ideologically committed to the IWW, to socialism and to industrial unionism, he is not an activist really from the mid-30s forward. He'll live, in other words, another 15 years in sort of weakened state. His wife the primary breadwinner. Fletcher was buried in an unmarked grave in Brooklyn, although there's some of us right now who are sort of part of an informal memorial committee working to basically raise funds to get a significant marker for him at a cemetery in Brooklyn, as well as perhaps something more, as well as perhaps something in Philadelphia, although much of this is to be determined. To conclude, well, I'm quite sympathetic to the life and activism of Ben Fletcher. That's probably not surprising. Many people considered Fletcher to be really one of the great Black labor leaders in all of US history. Nowadays, I compare him to the suddenly famous Fred Hampton, because Fred Hampton was 21 when he was murdered by the Chicago police. Fred Hampton, like Ben Fletcher, was a socialist. Fred Hampton, like Fletcher, was born into a Black working class family in an industrial city. Fred Hampton, like Fletcher, organized across racial and ethnic lines, very much believed in the idea that you needed a multiracial, multinational, left-wing movement to sort of basically overthrow white supremacy and capitalism, right? Both of them also suffered repression from the state, although Fletcher was not murdered by the federal government in the same way as Hampton. Nevertheless, we might think of Fletcher as being worthy of that sort of attention, right? Even though, as I've said already, very few people know his name, although I very much appreciate that now all of you folks do. I appreciate your attention, and once more, thanks to the Portland DSA and to the other groups for inviting me to speak about Ben Fletcher and the IWW to you this morning. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. That was really fun and interesting. Thank you for that. So next, we have our other presenters, Opal, or I'm sorry, Olivia and Opal in that order. So I'll just go ahead and introduce them. Opal Pace is a Black, biracial, queer woman writer, educator, and organizer from the Portland metro area. Her work focuses on capitalism, leftist politics, racial justice, popular culture, chronic illness, climate change, and sexual violence. She graduated cum laude from Portland State University in 2019, receiving her BA in Child and Family Studies with a minor in Black Studies. Olivia was one of the lead organizers of the Disarm PSU campaign from 2015 to 2020. She is a previous member of the organizing committee for the Growing Seed Workers Union, which won their union vote by 90% on March 11th of 2020. So let's hear from you, Olivia, and then I can introduce Opal.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and thanks so much, Peter, for that awesome introduction. What I'm wanting to share and what's standing out to me is that the way Peter describes kind of this period where the IWW is forming has like some very striking similarities to where we're at now, right? So a tiny class of the elite, a tiny ruling class, complete like lack of regulation, falling apart of regulatory efforts from the government onto corporations, and a very, very weak working class. We know, like in the last decade, union density has been lower than it's been, I think, since the 50s. So yeah, we're in this very, very significant period that has a lot of correlation to that period where the ILWU is forming. And my roommate's dog just ran into my room. Get down. Sorry, an Australian Shepherd puppy just came in and ran around my room, but now he's out. Okay, obviously in 1905, this was followed by this really powerful history from the IWW. And now today, I think we're seeing potentially really the dawn of a new period of really significant union organizing. And I think while I'm here to kind of talk about my time as a childcare worker organizer, I think I want to note that I think this potential dawn for this new movement is epitomized by the Amazon union work going on in Alabama. And we also see correlations there between the period that Peter's talking about, where we have a huge number of workers who are kind of lured in by these scraps, these slightly higher wages, slightly higher benefits than we see across the country, and other kinds of work. And because of this allure of these like scraps that Amazon provides workers, they are able to work them like robots. I've seen workers describe the conditions in Amazon. And in Bessemer, Alabama, where this union organizing is happening, and where they might potentially win their union vote on March 29th of this month, the workforce there is 85% Black. Amazon is the second highest private sector employer in the country, and they, while not being under the ILWU or IWW, the union that they're joining has this really significant history and connection with the civil rights movement. And this is really exciting because it's coming, this like super significant union drive that's happening right now is coming right on the heels of the last 7 years of the most significant civil rights organizing in US history. And so I think that we are kind of entering this critical period where union organizing and how much power it could have in the next few years, and I think union organizing is becoming slightly more mainstream, is intersecting with the history, with the current civil rights struggle in a way that hasn't really happened before. I think we're going to see something really significant coming up. And that also connects to our work here around childcare organizing in Portland. Childcare work is a very we call it a very feminized labor field. It's 45% Black and brown, and very much connects to this history of Black people kind of being forced to uphold the US economy through doing domestic work, through kind of holding up the economic interest of the white ruling class, right? We see it through slavery, and then we see it through this long legacy of extremely underpaid domestic work that Black people, especially Black women, have been forced to participate in. And through Growing Seeds, the school that I used to work at, through our organizing, we see this legacy, the powerful legacy of kind of the IWW and ILWU, their powerful legacy of being anti-capitalist compared to the other contemporary unions that AFSCME, like the AFL-CIO, IWW and ILWU, even to this day, really showed up for the universal preschool struggle and for the Growing Seeds Workers Union struggle, and really allowed those, and really supported us, and the ILWU allowing for the Growing Seeds effort to be extremely worker-led, allowing us to take our demands and to take our messaging as far as we wanted it to go. And that very much was prioritizing, talking about the correlation between childcare work and the liberation of women and Black and brown people. And I think I'll pass it off to Opal, and then we can just vibe it out.
Thanks, Olivia.
Well, actually, Opal, let me go ahead and introduce you. So Opal Brockschmidt is a childcare worker and organizer in Portland. They were active during the Universal Preschool Now campaign, which Olivia made reference to. It's a grassroots initiative that passed in November general election and will bring universal preschool and living wages for preschool workers in Multnomah County. They were involved during the beginnings of the Childcare Labor Alliance, a group of childcare workers in Portland dedicated to organizing for childcare workers' rights and for the betterment of our families and those we care for. So Opal, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Luisa and Olivia, and Peter for being here. This is great. I'm so happy we're able to have this conversation. I definitely see a lot of correlations, like Olivia mentioned, between the work that we've been doing here in Portland for the past few years and the history that you've talked about. It's been wild, especially this past year. COVID has changed so much of our organizing to huge extremes, right? like for one example, super early on in the pandemic, my last day of work at my preschool where I was working in person was March 13th of 2020. And I had an interview the very next day to go join Growing Seeds. And I was like so excited. It was going to be at like the one location that we like really needed support at. And I had been, the Childcare Labor Alliance was started out of the beginnings of Up Now. Sorry if I'm all over the place and you need some questions afterwards. But as we were building the Childcare Labor Alliance, we were building Up Now. Growing Seeds workers came in and like needed support, and we got introduced, and we just like really started. It was like this amorphous, helpful, like we're going to support each other to get where we need to go kind of thing. And I'm very appreciative of that group of organizers and Olivia and everybody else at Growing Seeds, because it was such a journey, and I've learned so much along the way, especially when we were like really, really ready to go to the unions and like really ready to get some help. And the people who responded to us and like actually wanted to listen to us was like IWW and ILWU. Like the bigger unions didn't want anything to do with us. Like we were small potatoes. Oh, my cat is here. This is Blanche. So, and it was so amazing to me that these like super radical unions wanted to take on this group of, like Olivia mentioned, like super feminized workforce, right? For the most part. But they just saw the value in it. They saw the synchronicities in it, and the help that we received for building the campaign, for building the Labor Alliance, to getting us all through the COVID year was like just so amazing. And we wouldn't have done it without the support of ILWU, like specifically, but also like our Wobbly friends along the way, right? So many of us here in Portland are like, you can't work in Portland without working with the Wobs. And I honestly love that. And I love that history. So like, I want to touch on back like when COVID hit and like really dive back into that for a second, because it completely changed everything, right? Like we were beginning to grow various union drives in various schools. Like we were really on like the up and up. I was super ready. I was dealing with some transphobic management things at my last preschool. So I was like really ready to jump ship and go join Growing Seeds personally and like be involved with that, like fully hands-on finally. And that was, my interview was set for March 14th. March 13th was like our last day anywhere, I feel like. And all of a sudden we were like, what is happening? Are we furloughed? Some people, some comrades of mine were working in like an emergency care center and went without pay for like more than a month. Like they were still working and they were just going without pay, or then they were like getting a percentage of their pay. Like across the board, all of these like huge labor violations were happening, right? And it seemed like nobody cared because of the nature of our work as childcare workers, right? And the only people who were here to help were us and our comrades at ILWU and at IWW. And things have like calmed down through our organizing together and just like the camaraderie and the meetings and everything. Like we got each other through this year, right? Employers really were forcing us to choose eventually, once all the PPP loans came out and all these things started happening. Like my employer had furloughed us and then asked us all to quit because she filled out the PPP loan like information wrong and was like, I wasn't supposed to furlough you, so now I need you all to quit so we can hire new people. And I was like, that's messed up. Like that is a huge labor violation. And we weren't the only ones it was happening to, right? And then the places that were staying open were asking their workers to choose between like their health and safety, right? Like if they had complications, autoimmune diseases, like my partner has an autoimmune disease and is on immunosuppressants, and like I was not about to expose him to everything like that I would be picking up in childcare. Like they literally we were forced to choose between like our own health and safety and money and a job, right? My employer luckily didn't really fight on unemployment and stuff. And personally, I was able to go into some nannying pretty easily, but a lot of us then had to turn to the private sector. And there's a lot more about that too, right? Like all of a sudden we're doing like nannying and online schooling, like 8 to 6 every day in other people's homes. Like somebody wrote an article super early on saying like the return of the governess, you know, kind of system where you're essentially like attached to this family and in this bubble, and you could only see them, and you're doing all of the schoolwork and all of the care work while the parents were working from home. And it was just a nightmare, quite honestly, for a while there for a lot of us. But I hope there's light at the end of the tunnel now that everyone's getting vaccines, and we'll see. Not that I super believe things are going back to normal. I also don't really agree with the push to go back to schools in person, like this huge all of a sudden. It seems against science, in my opinion. But anyway, that's all I really have. Should we vibe on it, or what do you think?
Yeah, let's vibe on it.
Okay.
Just as you were talking and as I'm kind of remembering, that period of my life. And I'm thinking about, right, the period that we're talking about with Peter of like 1905, the beginning of the IWW was obviously an all-male workforce. And as women over the last century have been allowed to enter the workforce, we still see this like legacy of sexism, right? In these very feminized fields where the most like one of the most oppressive things about the period of the beginning of COVID, where we were all of a sudden having to choose between taking unemployment or maintaining job security, but putting ourselves at risk, was I looked around to see all of these people just presuming that because I am a teacher who makes $17 an hour, like I am a bad person if I am not willing to put my life on the line to help to take care of these children and continue, like in this period of COVID, where it's the forces at play are very much about like coercing women, coercing feminized people, and saying like, well, if you love these children, if you really care about these children, like you shouldn't care about the money. Like you shouldn't care if your life is at risk while you're at work. This is your job. This is like what you've chosen, and this is just kind of what you're expected to do. And that is something that I know growing seeds workers who are still organizing, still bargaining and contending with some extremely hostile reactions from my former boss are contending with, where childcare providers are very much like, I'm a small business, like I can't do this without you. You're ruining these families' lives, you're ruining my life, like, and why do you think you deserve anything better? Because this is a labor of love. And but I think that's like what's so powerful about childcare worker organizing, is that it's an extremely under-organized field, and it combats these like really deep-seated ideas that we have about like reproductive labor, the labor that is traditionally passed off, or that is traditionally thought of as being that of women, where in like if you're a longshoreman, or if you're working in a factory, if you're working in a restaurant, you are like creating something, and like you're doing this kind of labor every day that is very directly like being sold to create wealth for your boss. And in childcare organizing, that's different. You're not creating a product. You are like doing something that is genuinely important to society. You are like crafting young minds, like taking care of children's physical, intellectual like needs, and it's not a product. It's not something that can be as intensely commodified. What's being commodified is like your love and your care. And that is so deep seated in this history of slavery, this history of Black women's labor being used to like directly uphold like the wealth and the power of the white people that they work for, of white families, of and of like the white ruling class and of like the white middle class, frankly. And so organizing that field has a lot of significance because I feel like it really cuts into this kind of more insidious part of racial capitalism. And that is like that's where Black and brown women fit in. Obviously Black and brown women are not the only people working in childcare, but it is significant in that it's disproportionately Black and brown women, and there's a reason for that. So yeah, and it's been a struggle. It has been extremely difficult, and we don't have a lot of allies. Obviously, you know, the ILWU is not, when we chose the ILWU as our union, there was a lot of confusion from people who are kind of on the outside of just like, why aren't you going with a teachers union? How is this? Longshoreman, like, what do you mean? Like, what are you doing? And that was something that our boss really tried to use against us, of being like, these people like are just like which is what bosses always say, right? They have no relation to you, they don't represent you at all. This has nothing to do with us. Like, our relationship has nothing to do with these longshoremen. But the reason we chose the ILWU is because we understood our work at Growing Seeds as being a part of a greater project, as being like a part of the greater project of building a new and better society eventually, and the understanding that union organizing is part of a revolutionary project. And more locally and more currently, understanding how like this was part of this new like political landscape happening in Portland with universal preschool. Like, Portland right now is on the front end of this new kind of union organizing, because again, like, childcare work is so underorganized, and feminized fields are so underorganized. And so it's really exciting to kind of compare and contrast and see how this movement is going to go forward.
So if I could respond to a few of Olivia and Opal's comments, which I very much appreciate learning from them. I guess I have 2 points I would love to sort of include. You know, what Olivia was just saying about the feminization of labor and the working class, that's deeply important, right? Like, this is why intersectionality is so sort of vital, because it's even hard to sort of combine. We're talking about class issues, we're talking about race issues, we're talking about issues of sex, right? You know, Silvia Federici is the best known person on PM Press, the book publisher that published my book, right? Who talks about the social reproduction of labor, right? Like, that there's trillions of dollars in our economic system that are uncounted because it's female labor, right? Like, it's basically women who are sort of raising children, taking care of the home, preparing food, cleaning. Now, a small portion of that is paid labor, underpaid labor, because it's female labor, right? Like, but that this is, that if we want to understand capitalism, in other words, we have to actually put a dollar amount on that labor, right? And until we do so, A, childcare workers won't get paid fairly, right? But B, we just won't understand actually what we're talking about when we're talking about capitalism, right? Like, and so to ignore, and that's really about sexism and patriarchy, right? Like, regardless of the sorts of women doing this labor, women across the world are not being paid, and it's mostly women doing that sort of work, right? Which is essential work to maintain human existence, right? Like, I mean, forgetting about anything more, right? Like, it's not surprising to me. My second point is that it's the ILWU and the IWW who were sympathetic to Opal and Olivia and their fellow workers who wanted to organize, right? not to sort of over romanticize the IWW, right? But they have for 115 years been organizing the unorganized, right? Most unions don't want to touch these sorts of workers because they're considered unskilled, they're considered low paid, they're women, they're immigrants, they're people of color, right? They rotate out of the workforce, they're part-timers, right? And so, you know, if that's what unions think, unions are going to be irrelevant, right? Like, because they're essentially ignoring the majority of the working class, right? Like, it's pathetic that that's still the case, right? Like, and that it's still actually a minority of unions who see otherwise, right? The last point I'll make related to that is why the ILWU and the IWW, and there are other unions that also sort of, I think, are progressive, right? Like, is that you need sort of an ideology, right? Like, it's not enough to say, I want to make more money, I want to work shorter hours, right? Yes, we want to make more money and we want to work fewer hours, right? Like, but if that's the sum total of our game, we lose. That's one of the reasons the AFL-CIO has diminished for the last 50 years, right? Like, is because they had nothing but give us a little larger piece of the pie, right? Like, and so as the mainstream labor movement has sort of faded into irrelevance, what we need is sort of a radical politics to sort of infuse unionism, right? It has to be anti-racist, as I sort of really focus on, but it also has to be anti-sexist, anti-xenophobic, right, et cetera, because that's, otherwise the bosses will win, right? And how do we know that? It's because we can look at the recent past. The bosses have been winning for decades, right? Like, and so if we want to continue to lose, we do the same things, right? If we actually want to win for a change, we have to change, right? Like, and so that includes changing our politics, right? Lowercase p, right? Like, is what I'm talking about. Yeah. So thank you very much, Olivia and Opal, and I apologize for interjecting there.
So actually, this is the part of the event where I can ask the panelists a couple of questions, but I do want to remind folks to any questions that you might have to send them to host/Keith Guthrie. So you can go to the participants and search for host. And so we can kind of load them up for audience Q&A. So the first question is to Opal and then Olivia, respectively. So could you kind of briefly explain the campaigns that you were organizers for? So the Childcare Alliance and Growing Seeds. So our audience can kind of have a picture of how those things unfolded. So, you know, just generally, briefly from start to where it is now. I don't want to say ending.
Yeah, it's definitely still ongoing. So, so let's see. Back in 2018, we had a group at DSA called Tax the Rich, which just got started up again now that the Up Now campaign is in its like, I'm not going to say final stages, but like new evolution, right? Let's call it that. And we decided through lots of deliberation that we were going to focus on universal preschool for Multnomah County, what that was going to look like. Took a lot of numbers, took a lot of deciding between how we wanted to have it outrolled, like the largeness or the smallness of it, right? A lot of math. I came into it because I was approached and said, like, we need childcare workers. Would you be willing to help organize childcare workers? And I was like, yes, of course. And at the time, I just started hosting very small meetings at Cider Riot, back when Cider Riot was open. I miss them so much. We would meet in their back room, like their little game room, and it was wonderful. For people out of town, they were an anti-fascist bar that let us just be there for free because they loved the idea of childcare workers unionizing and working. And they're no longer in operation for a lot of reasons. Look it up online. There's been literal riots at Cider Riot. So these very radical people let us in, let us organize. Then we started hosting meetings at the Dismantle, Build, Change Center in North Portland, Northeast Portland. They're like right, I believe, on the border there. again, our meetings just kept growing. We kept getting more and more people, which is why we needed the larger space. At that time, the Growing Seeds workers, I got introduced to one of their organizers at I got introduced to them at a labor training that I was taking with the labor working group at DSA. And we just like realized that we needed some help with each other's campaigns, and that like we could be really beneficial for each other and like just kind of grow parallel. So we started meeting together and started helping each other out and making connections. And it has been a few years now of like working together. Do you want to add anything on, Olivia?
Yeah, I mean, on my end, I met Opal before I worked at Growing Seeds. I started working at Growing Seeds in June of 2019. Yeah, knowing full well that there was a union effort there that was being led by like good friends of mine and people that I had already organized with before. So go to Growing Seeds, basically unofficially assaulting, but not really. And as we were doing our organizing, especially in the earlier stages before I even worked there, the DSA and the IWW and people like Opal who were doing this organizing were continually a resource for us, offering us support, utilizing trainings from the DSA, and just kind of helping us along the way, because even like you would think that since teaching is such a unionized field, you would think there would be more resources for childcare workers, because there is really no difference. Like the work that we were doing at Growing Seeds was and is teaching, but there really weren't a lot of resources. There really wasn't a lot of guidance for us doing this work. So Opal, the DSA up now, were continually people that we were able to look to just to give us guidance. And then we eventually, on the council of a lot of organizers that we respected, went with the ILWU. And because the ILWU, like once they entered our lives, were just like the kindest and best people ever. And I mean, it's been like a big struggle. Mostly because we won our union vote 2 days before everything shut down. And so negotiating a contract and continuing to rally support is very, very hard in this period where bosses try to create this sense of scarcity, and the opportunity to create a sense of scarcity is only magnified by COVID. They're like, we really bosses usually we don't have the money to pay you more. If we pay you more, we're gonna have to shut down all this stuff. And that kind of fear mongering, the opportunity for it is so outsized in COVID. And so that's been really, really hard. But even through COVID, organizers have continued to bring all of these new workers in to the union and continue to try to keep a positive energy and morale around the union. But it's hard, and Opal kind of described, the entire childcare field has been completely turned on its head. But we very much worked alongside the Universal Preschool Now campaign in our unionizing efforts, and we're really excited to see what the benefits of universal preschool do for the conditions of workers at Growing Seeds, and how that will bolster unionizing efforts across the city.
Okay. Thanks for that. So the next question is for Peter. We take for granted IWW's radical egalitarianism, right? So as a kind of wobbly historian, could you explain the genesis for why IWW formed as an anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-xenophobic organization? and how continued education worked to continue to raise the consciousness of workers, right? Anywhere from kind of the experiential knowledge of on-the-job actions, right, to actual education. So in the traditional sense, you know, reading groups, that type of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a big question, and I'm not sure I have a great answer, but when the IWW was founded, it was founded upon these principles. I would say that they didn't create these principles, right? They sort of built on others, right? And so, you know, even in the 19th century, people, as socialism as an ideology starts to develop, right, in Europe and in North America and other places, socialists generally sort of understood that it's a class division, right? Like, and so us and them, and that included the idea that us and all of us, right? Like men and women, people of different ethnic and national heritages, whatnot. However, it's very much worth noting that historically and even today, that some socialists actually don't live up to that idea at all, right? Like, but you know, historically, for instance, there were socialists, people who self-identified as socialist and working class unionists, who were also white supremacists, right? And so, for instance, in South Africa and Australia, two countries I study a bit, they called for a white South Africa, a white Australia, right? They were simultaneously oppressing the indigenous people of Australia, but also sort of claiming to be socialists, right? And so, by contrast, the Wobblies were a little bit more self-aware generally, and a little bit less horrible, right? Like, and so they also called themselves socialists, but said, you know, called bullshit on these ideas that you could be a socialist and also exclusive, right? And so, for example, the IWW was the first white organization, first union in New Zealand to organize indigenous Maori workers, right? Their newspaper, it was a non-Maori person, but who knew Maori, and there was a column, right, in the New Zealand IWW newspaper in Maori for Maori workers, right? Like, and so, although most of my work on the IWW is in the US and really focuses on African-American leaders like Ben Fletcher, I do want to point out that the Wobblies were very internationalist in their heyday. Really, 1905 into the 20s is when they were the most influential. Then for many decades, the IWW diminished to very small size, despite maybe powerful ideas because of repression, but also maybe rivalries, et cetera. You know, how they do this work, which is maybe the second part of Lisa's question, is, you know, in the IWW mottos is like educate, agitate, organize, right? Or educate, agitate, emancipate. And so educate, right? You know, it's not just for people like me who are professors or my students, right? We all are obligated to learn, to educate ourselves, because otherwise we will not achieve our goals, right? Like, and so at that time in the early 20th century, and I noted that Ben Fletcher was not even a high school graduate. He was clearly very intelligent and very likely very well read, but he didn't receive a high amount of formal education because of his class and race backgrounds, right? Like, but they had reading groups, right? They had discussion groups. What we are doing now in a different technological format is exactly what unions of clever unions were doing 100 years ago, right? Like, so I give the example, this is 1921, 100 years ago, right? In 1921, maybe the most notorious incident in America was the Tulsa Race Massacre, which began what now is Memorial Day weekend, right? And so the centennial is coming up. When that happened, the Local 8 held an educational forum in the summer of 1921 in Philadelphia, where they talked about the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? It often was called the Tulsa Race Riot, but whichever term you use, right? Like, and they, according to the reports, which were in the Messenger, right? This sort of Harlem-based socialist magazine had someone present at this meeting. It's reports on it. So this is how we know this meeting happened, right? We didn't record it and put it on YouTube, right? Instead, we read the Messenger, right? Like, and you know, it says like white and black members of Local 8 sort of saw what was happening in Tulsa as essentially a threat, because they saw that white supremacy was in fact sort of a real possibility that white working class people could embrace. right? Like, because who was doing the killing in Tulsa? It wasn't just rich white people, it was probably a lot of working class white people were involved too. And so even though it had city and state support for the effort, right? Like, and so really you have a cross-class white collaboration to sort of kill hundreds of Black people in Greenwood in Tulsa. What's Local 8 do? They talk about it and they say, this is a threat to class unity, right? Like, you don't assume that people know that, right? That's a huge mistake, right? Because people might embrace other things that they find attractive for any number of reasons, right? Like, and in the air we breathe in the United States of America, we breathe white supremacy, right? Like, and so I am racialized, right? Like, whether I like it or not, when I see people of color, I've been programmed to see them as danger, right? Like, and so the only way to do it is to talk about it, right? Like, to read about it and to sort of have these conversations, difficult perhaps, right? And so that's one example, right? So the IWW was very big. They're not the only union by any means, right? Like, unfortunately, you know, due to the internet and TV and radio, union halls are not the places they used to be, right? Like, and so the idea that unions, workers would get together and sort of hang out and talk and read, socialize, drink, et cetera, that's a beautiful idea. Unions, both radical and non-radical, are generally not those sorts of spaces because people have retreated to their own homes and their other worlds, right? They can be such spaces, and I would suggest they should be such spaces. So I think that actually post-COVID, we need public spaces where organizations, unions create, right? Whether it's what Opal said, that cider place, that sounds great, right? Even better, if it's actually a union or political organization that sort of hosts events with alcohol, right? Like, and other substances, maybe, right? Like, because you bring them
Sorry,
together.
we're just, sorry, no, go ahead, wrap up your sentence. I'm sorry, I have a lot of questions to get to. I'm so sorry. Also wanted to add, if you all have the gall to believe, some of the unions that I've worked for actually put in their bylaws that union dues can't be used for the purchase of alcohol. Can you guys believe that? A detriment to the cause. So the next question is for Opal, for both Olivia and Opal, in whatever order. Actually, I'll pick the order. It'll go Olivia and then Opal. How COVID impacted your organizing is a really important question because it's something that all organizers are dealing with.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can imagine, we were so excited. We had won our union by so much. Like, I think less than 10 workers at all 3 growing locations voted no. And one of them was an administrator who, like, was able to vote, basically. And so March 11th, we're on top of the world. And then 2 days later, we were like, what the fuck is going on? And it just immediately shifted our focus. Like, we had these very kind of, not lofty for the conditions we were in. Like, growing seeds in terms of childcare was by no means, had a lot of problems, but by no means the worst place to work. Like, and so we were like, with our union, like, we are going to be able to really, like, push for what should be standard, and more than standard. And then it immediately shifted what we had to focus on. Like, the first weekend of like COVID being a pandemic, lockdown happening, growing seeds wouldn't close. And this is like when we were in that really fearful time, right at the beginning, when, like, we really did not understand what COVID was, how it was spreading, and everything. Things were still dangerous, but everything felt very dangerous, if you remember that time period. And so we immediately had to, like, put together a petition to push them to close. In like a day or two, we had it signed by a very large number of workers and parents. And parents have kind of always been a critical aspect of our organizing and a really important ally. And growing has eventually closed. And then when it came to contract negotiations, we had to go into negotiating what's called a bridge contract, which is a contract that basically is for a shorter period of time, because we understood that there are some very, very present concerns with COVID that weren't necessarily going to be relevant, like post-COVID, which now, who knows, because this has changed everything about our lives and everything about the workforce and everything about our economy. But at the time, we were imagining that there would be a post-COVID time when things would go back to normal, and that we would need some very specific like very specific protections within COVID. And so that contract has been negotiated pretty quickly. And now there are some holdups that I don't think I'm allowed to talk about, but, and I'm also not on the organizing committee, so I can't anywhere, but it's affected everything. I mean, everything that we envisioned about what this would be like has, it's been much harder than we imagined. And we imagined it would be very hard. And I'm very grateful that our vote was that day. We were so lucky. It was just happenstance, so yeah.
Yeah, I was not a part of Growing Seeds at the time, and I'm not sure if I will be, but yes, we were extremely lucky the vote was that day, and I'm so grateful for it because we now have the ability to grow with the win of Growing Seeds, right? And at this point, I have resigned myself that my name is out there enough as being a part of Up Now and a side parallel organizer with Growing Seeds that I'm not sure I can get a job working at a childcare center anymore, quite honestly. I've been a troublemaker for too long. Previous to COVID, I had been trying to unionize my very small shop at the preschool that I was working at, which I'm not going to mention because I'm not on good terms necessarily with them anymore. And we were getting a lot of union busting stuff, a lot of we're a family. I was dealing with a lot of transphobic things from my higher ups, and I was feeling really sick and tired, which is why I wanted to jump ship. And then March 13th hit, we all got furloughed. We all got separated from our kids, our classes and that kind of stuff. And it was very hard. And just like Olivia mentioned, the people who were there for us were the parents, right? The parents were so upset. And at this particular school that I was working at, the owner, who never worked on site at either of the locations, was essentially demanding the parents still pay their full tuition while we were in shutdown. But she had already furloughed all of us. So they were it's not going to the teachers. We don't want to pay. They set up GoFundMes for the teachers. And the owner got so angry about it, so angry, and essentially said if you have money to pay the teachers, you should be paying me. And they were that's not how this works. We're here for our teachers. And I'm still on really good terms with my cohort's parents. And we've talked about kind of having a social distance play day at the park now that everyone's a year older, and we just miss everybody, and we'll see how that goes, right? But I've been extremely grateful for the parents that I learned and have had amazing relationships with since then. And yeah, COVID just completely changed everything. My coworkers at that school suddenly really wanted to try to organize together, to fight for each other. As our boss was telling us we needed to quit, they all turned to me and they were we need help. How do we do this? One person was able to help do unemployment stuff because she had a friend working in unemployment. I was able to help us talk union stuff. And so we just banded together and started helping each other and caring for each other, because it seemed like nobody else was except for the parents, right? So I see him at time.
So we've actually gotten really good questions, and a lot of them. So so thank you everybody for being thoughtful and submitting them. And so I would ask our presenters, I'll go ahead and read the questions, but if we could keep it, really be mindful of the time because I want to get through them all. So the first question, so now we're transitioning to the audience Q&A. That's not evident. And our first one is from Mitch. So this one's a bit theoretical, but there's a current narrative in leftist spaces around work as inherently violent in that we should continue to pursue quote post-work society. But how would care workers and Wobblies approach the inherent nature of work and whether the promise of post-work has contradictions that need to be drawn out and tested. And so just reminding everybody, this is a conversation. So there might be divergent perspectives, but it's all part of all part of the collective learning. So I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, big question. I'll give it a go. You know, historically and in the present moment, and probably for the foreseeable future, we live in a capitalist world. And so, like, imagining a society that's socialist, if we can, right, is one thing. You know, but historically, the Wobblies mocked work because, of course, they were exploited, right? And so one of my favorite Wobbly songs is Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, right? So Wobblies were sort of often attacked for not wanting to work, right? And they sort of then turn that around, right? Like, and so hallelujah, I'm a bum, hallelujah, bum again, hallelujah, give me a handout to revive us again, right? Like sort of an amazing song. You know, but in a society that this question is sort of envisioning, is there a post-work society? You know, honestly, I'm not so sure that that's attractive if we weren't exploited for our labor. But if we could actually do the vocations that we wanted to do and contributed to our society and world, I don't sort of foresee waking up in the morning, doing nothing all day and then going to sleep, right? Like, even if that might be fun for a while, right? I actually would want to do something. I would want to do something with other people and hopefully for some larger good, right? And so although, you know, the world of Star Trek is, it's never clear if they're socialists or not, right? Like they're working, right? But they're doing something meaningful, right? Like, and so the question is, can we create a society where the work we do is valued and meaningful and not exploited? I think as a human, but also as a socialist, the answer is yes, right? I'm waiting for that world because it doesn't yet exist, right? Like, so personally, this sort of notion that all work is violent and, you know, what's a post-work society look like? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I envision that in a socialist world, we'll continue to do some work, but we'll just not be exploited in the same ways. Or at least that's my hope. Yeah.
And I'll just hop onto that briefly. That yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with Peter. And the only thing I would add is just like specifically from the perspective of a childcare worker, it's like there will never be a period where me and Opal's work is not relevant. There will never be a society where children can like become like horses and just like can like walk as soon as they're born and like can just like and be self-sufficient without the guidance from adults. Like, I don't know, maybe evolution, something evolutionary will happen that will make that true. But I can't envision a society where that's true right now. And so like, yeah, love and care and education and those things that we value, like conceptually, it like takes work. There will never be a society where we do not have to put work into taking care of each other.
I'll jump on there super quick too, with a project I'm really excited about that I'm not going to talk too many details, but here in Portland, there's a group of us who have started talking about creating a childcare co-op, which I'm not going to curse, but I'm so freaking pumped about it because I really feel like it is at least like the way I answer the question of like, how do we do this work without being like exploited for like our love and our care and everything, which like you so wonderfully said, Olivia, like is constantly exploited by the boss, by the provider. Like we really have, it's not necessarily like worker boss, it's provider and caregiver, right? Like that's our like, you know, kind of divide that we have in this workforce. So when the group of us that are talking about creating a childcare co-op, I'm so excited about it because like we don't have that model, at least not here in Portland, right? Like when we think of co-ops, we think of like the food co-ops, you know, and like the gardening co-ops and that kind of stuff. But the possibilities of what we can create there is really exciting to me. I also personally am beginning doula training next month, and there is like there's push, especially in Oregon, to return to like traditional birthing methods, like within birthing centers with midwives and doulas. And like you can now bill Oregon Health Plan, like the Care Oregon, like the closest thing we have to socialized healthcare. I feel like you can bill that doula services for that in Oregon, which is so cool. And there's a lot there as far as like racial inequality and like the way that I'm not going to talk too much about it, but like if you read into like the way that like Black doulas and Black birth workers were like demonized, and that's why we have all of these, like, it's a direct correlation to why we have such like a hospitalized birthing world these days. It's very, very interesting to read about, and I recommend it. So
thanks, that was a great answer, and thanks for bringing it back to kind of real world organizing, Opal. So our next question is from Sarah Allen. Do you think unions that are, you know, what some might say less democratic, whatever that word means, not explicitly anti-capitalist and not focused on anti-racism, can be reformed from within, or do workers need to organize, you know, new organizations or new associations?
I think and I feel like I'm not maybe informed enough to answer this like fully or confidently, because I've only been a part of one union, and I feel positively about that union. But I mean, I think both things are possible, right? Like, I don't think that union, like the bureaucratic leadership of the SEIU or of AFSCME are so like all like powerful or so dominant that they can, but there is no like reforming them, and there is no like possibility for workers to kind of take more power in those spaces. And you know, starting a union, building a union is extremely difficult and takes a lot of work. Yeah, and takes a lot of like, takes a lot of paperwork, takes a lot of very like tedious, like, yeah, a lot of very tedious organizing that takes a lot of energy. And I also think that the organizing that's going to be most powerful is always going to be bottom up. And so, you know, workers would do well to kind of use their own collective power as much as possible, and not maybe put themselves in positions where they have to contend with like bureaucratic, undemocratic, like racist union leadership. But I don't know, I think both are possible, and both are yeah, powerful strategies, referring to bottom up organizing, and building new organizations, and like pushing for more democratic unions that already exist.
So just before anybody else answers, just being mindful of the time, maybe a brief answer to this question.
I'll go for, I think it depends, right? I actually, to give historical examples, right? In the US, essentially both the IWW, but then the communists looked at the AFL and said, this cannot be reformed, right? Like instead, let's form other institutions, right? Like maybe you are in both dual carters, but really that, but actually in France, the left took the mainstream labor movement and was able to capture it, you might say, and then move it left. And actually, to this day, the mainstream, the largest labor federation in France, the CGT, right, like, is sort of left. And so I think it does depend. So I wouldn't say that there has to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, right? Actually, I think a clever organizer would sort of assess the situation and make a choice strategically, because I think there's something to be said for capturing a large institution that already has sort of members and sort of a structure, and sort of moving it. Obviously, that's what the DSA, you know, does in theory, right? Like, and so the idea of that you have to jettison the main institution and go for and build a new one, yes, sometimes, but I'm not sure if it's all the time.
I can pass for the sake of time.
So we're actually getting towards the end. I don't mind going over if the panelists are okay with it, just to be able to knock out some questions from the audience to respect their time. But I did want to announce the winners, and so that's something I'm really looking forward to. It's like my Vanna White moment. So the winners of the 5-book door prize giveaway are Shane Skarmanok. I hope I didn't mingle that. Shane Skarmanok, Iris DeLee, Lacey Marie, Sarah Allen, and Vishal Kashi. So again, Shane Skarmanok, Iris Lee, Lacey Marie, Sarah Allen, and Vishal Bakshi. So make sure that you've DM'd the host your address so we can go ahead and send those books to you. Actually, you know what? I realize we do need to wrap up because the ASL interpreters, we need to respect their time, right? We certainly don't want to be in the practice of exploiting them in this type of talk. So let me just ask one last question before we wrap up, and something that maybe all of you all can answer. I guess they're all specific. So let me just actually say, is there anything within the context of this conversation that you guys want to share before we wrap up? And again, briefly, I'll kind of throw it over to the presenters because all the questions that we've gotten are specific to people.
I think we said a lot. I can't think of anything.
Okay. All right. So actually, you know what? Let's just, we can wrap up because we do have an ask of the audience. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, fingers crossed, for providing ASL interpretation. And thank you once again to our speakers, Peter, Opal, and Olivia. Once again, thanks to our co-sponsors, which is Jobs with Justice. And in terms of, something that folks in the audience can do that would directly help build power, arguably for the working class, is to support the PRO Act. So it stands for the Protecting the Right to Organize. Passing the PRO Act would make it easier for workers on the ground to be able to form unions and kind of build our collective capacity to build a just transition to a green economy, right? So the idea is that if we can push our overlords through organizing, of course, through on-the-ground collective organizing, if we could push them to pass legislation like this, then it certainly paves the path to be able to have enough worker power to pass something like the Green New Deal. So it would also get rid of the right to work, or as I have trained myself into saying, the right to work for less. So right to work for less is a racist history. It started in 1940s Jim Crow South to divide workers by race, undermined a kind of multiracial union organizing. And it was passed in 1944 in Florida. It's actually enshrined in the Florida Constitution. And it's prolific in more states than not. So one way you could help is phone banking. So DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, is phone banking workers in states where, again, crucial overlords have not yet signed onto the PRO Act. So each shift will have a quick intro to the campaign and training. And so everybody of every experience level are welcome. You're particularly welcome if you if you're monolingual, speak multiple languages. And so we'll go ahead and send that to, we can drop a link in the chat and then send it to folks who registered for the event. Also briefly, we'll be having an event next Sunday, Portland DSA Labor Working Group. We're having an event called Socialists in the Labor Movement, the Rank and File Strategy with Jane Slaughter. And so it's pretty easy to register. It's bit.ly, so bit.ly/Jane Slaughter, like the word is spelled. So thank you so much for joining us. And we're actually going to end this baby on time, so we can all celebrate that. So once again, thanks so much, Peter, Opal, Olivia, and Ben Fletcher, wherever you are now. Thanks so much, everybody.